Hi everybody, this is week 1, video 1 for 8th grade. With your instructions, you are supposed to watch this video, and this is where we listen to Frederick Douglass's first chapter of this book, his narrative. So I talk about this all in 4 or 5 of the videos, but he was a slave, he escaped, he learned to read and write and published this book, his narrative. It is an amazing, 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 amazing primary source. I suggest over quarantine time, over the summer, to get you really prepped for high school. You find this book. I'm sure it's in every library, or I think I bought this for like $6. It's an amazing read, a primary source about what he experiences as a slave. So we're going to read chapter 1. Then you're going to do an exit ticket on Google Classroom, and you'll be done for this first lesson. 2 more lessons for this week that you have to complete, so make sure you watch out for those. So here is the first chapter of his book. We're going to be skipping a couple sections of this first chapter just because it's not necessarily important. But in here, chapter 1, you can follow along on the screen, or if you just want to listen to it, that would be fine too. So he says, I was born in Tuckahoe, near Hillsborough, and about 12 miles from Easton in Talbot County, Maryland. I have no accurate knowledge of my age, never having seen any authentic record containing it. By far, the larger part of the slaves know as little of their ages as horses know of theirs. It is a wish of most masters within my knowledge to keep their slaves thus ignorant. I do not remember to have ever met a slave who could tell of his birthday. They seldom come nearer to it than planting time, harvest time, cherry time, springtime, or fall time. A want of information concerning my own was a source of unhappiness to me, even during childhood. The white children could tell their ages. I could not tell why I ought to be deprived of the same privilege. I was not allowed to make any inquiries of my master concerning it. He deemed all such inquiries on the part of a slave improper and impertinent, and evidence of a restless spirit. He's saying it's literally not important for you to know your age. The master is, but Frederick Douglass just wants the human right. The nearest estimate I can give makes me now between 27 and 28 years of age. I come to this from hearing my master say, sometime during 1835, I was about 17 years old. My mother was Harriet Bailey. She was the daughter of Isaac and Betsy Bailey, both colored and quite dark. My mother was a darker complexion than either my grandmother or grandfather. My father was a white man. He was admitted to be by such by all I ever heard speak of my parentage. The opinion was also whispered that my master was my father, but the correctness of this opinion I know nothing. The means of knowing was withheld from me. My mother and I were separated when I was but an infant, before I knew her as my mother. It is a common custom, in this part of Maryland from which I ran away, to part children from their mothers at a very early age. Frequently, before the child has reached its 12th month, its mother was taken from it and hired out on some farm a considerable distance off, and the child is placed under the care of an old woman, too old for field labor. For what the separation is done, I do not know, unless it is to hinder the development of the child's affection towards its mother, and to blunt and destroy the natural affection of the mother for the child. This is the inevitable result. So he's saying, why are they separating the babies from their moms? The only possible reason is to make the baby and the mom have no relationship, that the mom doesn't care about the child and the child doesn't care about mother, no family attachment. It's an awful thing that they used to do. I never saw my mother, to know her as such, more than 4 or 5 times in my life, and each of these times were very short in duration, and at night. She was hired by a Mr. Stewart, who lived about 12 miles from my home. She made her journeys to see me in the night, traveling the whole distance on foot after her performance of her day's work. She was a field hand, and a whipping is penalty of not being in the field at sunrise, unless a slave has special permission from his or her master to the contrary, a permission which they seldom get, and one that gives it the proud name of being a kind master. I do not recollect of ever seeing my mother by the light of day. She was with me in the night. She would lie down with me and get me to sleep, but long before I waked, she was gone. Very little communication ever took place between us. Death soon ended what little we could have while she lived, and with it her hardships and suffering. She died when I was about 7 years old, on one of my master's farms near Lee's Mill. I was not allowed to be present during her illness, at her death, or burial. She was gone long before I knew anything about it. Never having enjoyed, to any considerable extent, her soothing presence, her tender and watchful care, I received the tidings of her death with much the same emotions I should have probably felt at the death of a stranger. Called thus suddenly away, she left me without the slightest intimation of who my father was. The whisper that my master was my father may or may not be true, and true or false, it is but of little consequence to my purpose, whilst the fact remains, in all its glaring odiousness, that slaveholders have ordained, and by law established, that the children of slave women shall in all cases follow the conditions of their mothers. And this is done to obviously to administer to their own lusts and make a gratification of their wicked desires profitable as well as pleasurable. For by this cunning arrangement, the slaveholder, in cases not a few, sustains to his slaves the double relation of master and father. So what he's saying is his slave master would go around and most likely sexually assault the slave women, and if they get pregnant, then that's just another slave he has on hands that he got for free. It's profitable. He made money off of that relationship, I guess you could say. And the slave children would fall after their mother. It wouldn't, and then the master, of course, has another slave that he got for free. We're going to skip a couple of these paragraphs just because it's not necessarily important to the story. But we're going to go on to here where it says, I have two masters. My first master's name was Anthony. I do not remember his first name. He was generally called Captain Anthony, a title which I presume he acquired by sailing a craft on the Chesapeake Bay. He was not considered a rich slaveholder. He owned 2 or 3 farms and about 30 slaves. His farms and slaves were under the care of an overseer. The overseer's name was Mr. Plummer. Mr. Plummer was a miserable drunkard, a profane swearer, and a savage monster. He always went armed with a cowskin, that's a whip, and a heavy klugel. I have known him to cut and slash the women's heads so horribly that even master would be enraged at his cruelty, and would threaten to whip him if he did not mind himself. Master, however, was not a humane slaveholder. It required extraordinary barbarity on the part of an overseer to affect him. He was a cruel man, hardened by a long life of slaveholding. He would at times seem to take great pleasure in whipping a slave. I have often been awakened at the dawn of day by the most heart-rending shrieks of an own aunt of mine, whom he used to tie up to a joist and whip her naked back till she was literally covered in blood. No words, no tears, no prayers from his gory victim seemed to move his iron heart from its bloody purpose. The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped. And where the blood ran fastest, there he whipped longest. He would whip her to make her scream and whip her to make her hush, and not until overcome by fatigue would he cease to swing the blood-clotted cowskin. I remember the first time I ever witnessed this horrible exhibition. I was quite a child, but I remember it. I shall never forget it whilst I remember anything. It was the first of a long series of such outrages, of which I was doomed to be a witness and a participant. It struck me with awful force. It was the blood-stained gate, the entrance to the hell of slavery through which I was about to pass. It was a most horrible spectacle. I wish I could commit to papers the feeling with which I beheld it. This occurrence, I gotta plug in my laptop real quick, hold on. Okay. This occurrence took place very soon after I went to live with my old master, and under the following circumstances. Aunt Hester went out one night, where or for what I do not know, and happened to be absent when my master desired her presence. He had ordered her not to go out evenings, and warned her that she must never let him catch her in company of a young man who was paying attention to her, belonging to Colonel Lloyd. This young man's name was Ned Roberts, generally called Lloyd's Ned. Why master was so careful of her may be safely left to conjecture. She was a woman of noble form and of graceful proportions, having very few equals and fewer superiors in personal appearance among the colored or white women of our neighborhood. So she was a beautiful young girl. And he said, if I ever catch you with another young man, this Lloyd's Ned or Ned Roberts, that she would get into big trouble. Aunt Hester had not only disobeyed his orders in going out, but had been found in company with Lloyd's Ned, which circumstance I found, from what he said while whipping her, was the chief offense. He had been a man of pure morals himself. He might have been thought interested in protecting the innocence of my aunt, but those who knew him will not suspect him of any such virtue. Before he commenced whipping Aunt Hester, he took her into the kitchen, stripped her from neck to waist, leaving her neck, shoulders, and back entirely naked. He then told her to cross her hands, calling her at the same time a dead B word. After crossing her hands, he tied them with a strong rope and led her to a stool under a large hook in the joist, put in for that purpose. So it's kind of like a column in the center of the kitchen. He took her hands, tied them like this, and then hung them up above her head like this. She was facing the column. He made her get up on the stool and tied her hands to the hook. She now stood fair for his infernal purpose. Her arms were stretched up at their full length, so that she stood on the ends of her toes. He then said to her, now you dead bee, I'll learn you how to disobey my orders. And after rolling up his sleeves, he commenced to lay on the heavy cowskin, the whip. And soon the warm red blood, amid heart-rending shrieks from her and horrid oaths from him, came dripping to the floor. I was so terrified and horror-stricken at that sight that I hid myself in a closet and dared not venture out till long after this bloody transaction was over. I expected it would be my turn next. It was all new to me. I had never seen anything like it before. I had always lived with my grandmother on the outskirts of the plantation, where she put to raise the children of the younger women. I had therefore been, until now, out of the way of the bloody scenes that often occurred on the plantation. So that was chapter 1 of Frederick Douglass's book. I want you to take that feeling of how you're feeling right now after hearing that and reading that, and I want you to answer the questions on the Google form. It's on Google Classroom. It says 8th grade week 1, L1 for lesson 1. Every time I read that chapter, I get goosebumps. I get chills running down my arms, because imagining seeing that as a young child, just how damaging that could be and how scary that must have been. I've read this chapter probably 10, 12 times right now, and I literally have goosebumps on my arm from how this chapter is just so heavy, and I can't imagine living through what he lived through. On your lesson reflection, there's a couple questions, but the one I'm most interested about is, after listening to the recording of chapter 1, how did listening to this recording make you feel? We're going to come back to this chapter quite a few times the next couple lessons, putting ourselves in perspectives, thinking of how these people felt. So this feeling I want you to come back to a couple times in the next couple lessons. I will see you in the next lesson video. This is all for lesson 1. It's a heart-wrenching video. It's rough. But I'll see you in the next video.